Hello. So today we are going to review leases, where we are going to talk about the essential elements of leasehold interests, the various types of leases, and the means by which the leases may be terminated and discharged, and the remedies available to the parties for its breach. So some of the key terms will be actual eviction, assignment, constructive eviction, estate or tenancy at sufferance, estate or tenancy at will, estate or tenancy for years from period, a gross lease, a ground lease, a holdover tenancy, month-to-month tenancy, net leases, a non-disturbance clause, percentage lease, purchase options, renewal options, reversionary rights of refusal, sales and leaseback, security deposits, and so forth. So really, as a real estate professional, right, it's going to help you. You are going to be able to assist landlords, investment owners, maybe even prospective buyers, and of course, tenants who are looking to possibly rent a property out, right? And so it is important to understand these different types of leases, and we will even discuss some of the issues that can come up, right? So we know that right now, because of the moratorium, evictions and foreclosures since Mayish, give or take, and depending what state you're from here in the United States, is that they have decreased because of the government sanctions, right? But we also believe they are going to increase dramatically once the moratoriums are released, and depending on what kind of phases they put in, right? There has been in-home ownership. Basically, there has been an increase, right? I know it does talk a little bit about a drop in your yellow book, but really over the last 24 months, there has been an increase, right? Now, there is a relationship between the property owner and tenant when it comes to the lease, right? And that's what that is. It's a contract. It's a relationship, right? Now, when we talk about the owner of the real estate or the landlord, who is that? Is that the lessor or the lessee?
Less.
The
Lessor.
The lessor, right? So remember, the owner of the real estate or the landlord is the lessor. And then the lessee, Lessee, is the tenant, right? And so we have a lease or a contract between those two parties. And basically, what we're doing is we are transferring the lessor's right or rights to exclusive possession and the use of the property to the tenant for a specified time and for consideration. So when we talk about consideration, when we say that word when it comes to this real estate pre-licensing class, what do we mean when we say consideration?
Money.
Usually for the wonderful world of the moolah, right? You know, I used to always love blue. My grandmother used to always tell me, oh, you look so nice when you wear blue. But guess what I found out my favorite color to be? Green, baby, right? So anyways, rent is a fixed periodic payment made by a tenant of a property to the owner for possession and use, right? And the landlord retains a reversionary right to possession. So again, in your yellow book, in your general real estate practices book, modern real estate, that is in bold. So you need to remember that. The landlord retains a reversionary right to possession after the lease term expires, right? Now, in other classes, and again, in this one, we're going to talk about some different types of statutes. So one of them is called the Statute of Frauds. So who knows, what is the Statute of Frauds?
Statute of what?
Frauds. Frauds. Statute of Frauds. Right in their yellow book. What's the statute of frauds saying? And it's the same thing for most real estate agreements. What does it say? Can you and I just talk about, hey, if I live here for a year, I'll give you $1,000 a month, and then we kind of just shake hands and so forth. Are you going to be able to enforce that in the state of Connecticut in court?
No, you should have a written.
That's right. So what it's saying is that the statute of frauds in most states requires lease agreements, basically even for more than 1 year, to be in writing, to be enforceable, right? There are some opportunities where oral leases can be enforced, but usually not in Connecticut. And again, I'm supposed to tell you that I'm not an attorney and you should talk with your attorney. But I can almost promise you that if you don't have something in writing, it's probably going to turn out to be an issue for you. So try to get things in writing. Now, we use the term in this unit called leasehold estates. So what is a leasehold estate? Who remembers from their reading?
It's the property that's being leased.
Right? And it's the tenant's right to possess that property for a certain amount of time. So that's called a leasehold estate. It's usually considered to be what we would say a leasehold is personal property, right? When the tenant assumes most or many of the landlord's obligations under a lease for life or for more than 49 years and so forth, that might even be giving the tenant some privileges and benefits of ownership. So there's lots of different leasehold estates, and that's what we're going to go over next. So the first one is estate for years. Are we talking about that it has to be for years when we say estate for years?
No, it could be months, weeks, even days.
Yep.
Yeah. So what makes something an estate or tenancy for years?
What the contract has stated. It could, whatever they're looking to state it.
Right.
It has specific beginning and ending.
Exactly. It could be, and it has to be a specific beginning and an end date. Like as an example, I've once had an estate or tenancy for years, a lease that was signed that they were going to lease out this space in downtown Hartford from 7 o'clock a.m. until 7 o'clock p.m. this one particular day, because they were doing a photo shoot, right? And we made an agreement, we had a lease, we talked about how much they were going to pay, we talked about what the security deposit was, we talked about how they were going to leave the property, we talked about what was included, how much they were going to pay the landlord and so forth. So remember, it's an exact date. So if I tell you, and we're used to like it being a 1-year lease, but some people might do 6 months. Some people might just do a weird number of days. So today is October 16th, is it? Right? Today's October 16th. And you say, hey, I really need a place to rent, for a couple of months. Will you rent me your apartment? And I say, listen, I will rent you my apartment, but I can only rent it to you up until December 22nd. Because on December 22nd, my cousin is planning on moving in here. So it will be from October 16th till December 22nd. So
Rob, would
go ahead.
that fall under the category of some different timeshares, like Disney's only for 99 years and then you give it up? Or is that completely different?
It is different because that's more of a form of ownership, okay, instead of a lease, right? So remember, when it comes to this lease, or called an estate for term or estate for years, there's specific starting and end dates. Now, I told you I was going to rent you out this apartment till December 22nd. On November 22nd, or December 1st, or December 22nd, do I have to remind you to move out? Am I obligated to do that?
No.
No. And you see, that's a big thing, because people think, oh, well, I wasn't given 30 days notice. Well, most of the time it depends. If you have an estate for years, right? A definite period that you signed a document from October 16th to December 22nd, you don't get 30 days notice necessarily. You were given notice because you're an adult, you signed it, you were given notice the day that you signed it. Now, as a landlord, is it a good idea for me to give you reminders? Of course it is, right? Of course, you know, I'm going to give people 60 days, 45 days, 30 days, 15 days notice, right? Because I think that's a good idea to do that. But do I have to do it? Am I obligated? Could you say, well, I didn't move out because you didn't tell me, right? That's not acceptable. The lease was till December 22nd, right? So that's an important thing to remember when it comes to estate for years. It has to be a definite period. Now, when we say estate from period to period, which is another type of leasehold estate, what do we mean by that?
There is no end date, and it just automatically re-ups itself every single pay period. It just automatically reestablishes it.
Right, so it's continuity. So
Yeah.
like, for instance, if you're at a rooming house, a lot of times they will be like, okay, this is going to be weekly. So week by week by week. So then if they want you to move out, maybe they have to just give you 1 week's notice, right? The default in Connecticut, and remember, I only got 19 years experience. I only been working with tenants for about almost 20 years. So I might not be the perfect expert, right? So that's why we always have to tell you, talk to an attorney, and there's always exceptions and so forth. But usually, generally speaking, if you don't have a signed lease with someone, if you are on a month-to-month basis, that's the default for the state of Connecticut, right? And so that's called an estate from period to period. So technically anything that you, let's just say as the landlord, want to happen, like let's say you don't have a lease and it's just a month to month, because you might say, oh no, Rob, I don't have a lease with them. I'm not obligated to do anything. Well, that means you're on a month to month, right? And so let's say you want to increase the rent $50 a month. You need to give them 30 days notice. Let's say you want them to move. You need to give them 30 days notice. Because if you don't do that as the minimum, when you go to the housing court in the state of Connecticut, which I believe, and I'm putting it out there in the public, is very biased towards tenants, right? You're not going to win. You're not going to win your case because you only gave them 22 days notice. You didn't give it to them in writing and so forth. So you have to give at the minimum. It's better if you give more. It's better if you cooperate and try to help out the person rather than trying to go head on, because you're going to have a hard time in housing court when it comes to that stuff. So remember, it's continuity. It's created for an indefinite amount of time, month to month, week to week, year to year, depending on what the situation is. You have to give proper termination if that's what you want. The rent is usually payable at whatever intervals you originally had. So what kind of questions do you have on from period to period? Anybody have any questions?
The terms of when you're saying at the end, when you want somebody to move out, even though they've been on this extended month to month, if that was put in the original lease that the 30-day notice would have to be given, is that why you have to do it? Or what if it was all just, none of that was written in the original lease? Is it still best practice to do?
So then you really kind of go by the general rules for the state of Connecticut. So if you're into real estate, if you're into investment properties and residential and tenant landlord, there actually is a tenant landlord guide that's put together by the housing authority for the state of Connecticut. And it will tell you, so that's if you don't have anything written, if your lease doesn't talk about it and so forth, then that's what the basics will be. Now, you might put in your lease, hey, I only have to give you 15 days notice. But you see, that kind of goes against the general rules for the state of Connecticut. So if you try to enforce that and it doesn't work, and then you go to the housing administration, they're probably going to be like, no, it's 30 days notice. You can't go there and say, well, it's written in the lease that I can change the rent with 5 days notice, and I can tell them they have to leave within 12 days. And that's what it says, and that's what they agreed to. It's probably not gonna work because they're gonna be like, listen, it's basically 30 days notice.
Hey, Rob, what is this is a little bit off the subject, on a tenant, how late can they be with the rent without then you can ask them to give them notice to leave? How late can they be for rent? Not in this time, I know, in this era, in this since COVID, but before that, how much time is allowed?
All right. So we get into a lot of these discussions, and like I said, we've been doing this class for 13 years, so I'm prepared for this type of thing, for this discussion. And one of the things I do want to tell you is a lot of times I could come across as like the mean bad guy during this discussion. But the truth of the matter is I'm a stickler when it comes to this, because I'm not that guy that's going to be complaining to you, oh my God, it's so bad. It took me 4 months to get this tenant out. They didn't pay their rent for 4 months. Because if I say that, and if that happens, not COVID time period, but back in the old days, right? Whose fault is that really? That's the landlord's fault. It's not the tenant's fault. Because the truth of the matter is, let's say generally speaking, the rent is due on the 1st. Now, in my book, every day after the 1st, the rent is late. But can I do anything about it? No, because through the good graces and the generosity of the state, they say that that tenants get a 9-day grace period. So that means they have until technically the 10th to pay the rent. Now, when I wake up on the 11th that morning, and I look in my mailbox, I look in my hand, I look in my wallet, I look in my desk, and I don't see that rent, it's technically late, and it's technically in default. And I could, if I wanted to, which most of the time I do, start the eviction process that day, right? Because there's no reason why the landlords still have to pay their mortgage, pay their taxes, pay their insurance, and they're not getting the rent from the tenant unless they promised the tenant they were going to do something and didn't do it. Like the tenant doesn't have heat, the tenant doesn't have hot water, the tenant, if the landlord's not taking care of the property, hey, that's a big issue. But the landlord's doing everything they're supposed to be doing, then the tenant's supposed to do everything they're supposed to be doing. And I know people get on hard times and so forth, but the banks and the insurance companies and the town for the taxes, they don't say, hey, we know your tenant on the 3rd floor couldn't go to work last week because they hurt their back. So we're not gonna, we're gonna tell you don't have to pay that money this week or this month, right? So that's kind of a long answer to your question, but that's the truth of the matter.
Yeah, no. I was wondering because I've had tenants and, they always scream, I have 10 days to get my rent, and, and I hold them to it. And then after the 10th day, I say, you either give it to me or I'm up, and I've got it in a contract that says I'm upping your rent for every day that you're late until a certain point, and then I'm going to ask you to leave.
Yeah. And again, the truth of the matter is too, is people be like, I'll tell them, I don't wait. I'm reminding you in a gentle, nice way on the 28th that the rent is due on the 1st. And then when I don't get the rent on the 1st, on the 3rd, I'm reminding you, hey, listen, will you be paying the rent soon? And they'll tell me, well, I have until the 10th. Fine. But that just means you're a slow payer. And if someone was to ask me, because you're going to go get another apartment someday and they're going to call me and do you pay on time? I would say no, because the rent is due on the 1st. You just have a grace period until the 10th because of the state, not because of me. I'm not telling you the rent is due on the 10th. I'm telling you the rent is due on the 1st. And that's what we agreed upon when you were Mr. Happy-Go-Lucky that I gave you the apartment. Right? So again, see, now you guys are like, oh, this guy, man. But think about it. There's a lot going on here. And right now, there's a lot of real estate investors that they mean well. They like to have a nice place for people, and they're not getting any money. And the governor made that decision. All he had to do was take out his pen and sign a document. And now I went to you want to hear a crazy story? Here's a crazy story. On 3-4 days ago, I forget what day it was, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, this woman, she's a wonderful lady. She's a nurse. She's a few years older than me, very nice, trying to help people on a daily basis. She has a 20-something-year-old son who has a couple of kids, right? Now this 20-something-year-old son, he was living on the other side of the state in a very, very rough area. She said, listen, why don't you come over here, live with me, put your kids in schools over here, and just give me some money, you know, to help me out with this mortgage, because I'm having a hard time, you know, paying this mortgage. Everything sounds great. Well, guess what? I go to talk with her. She actually was another agent and me. We get in my car because we couldn't talk out loud. We couldn't talk in the house. She started crying. She's like, can you believe that my son pulled the governor's moratorium on me? We're like, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, my son is told me that he doesn't have to give me any money for rent or towards living in this house because the governor told him not to. And she says, and that's why I have to sell, because now I'm 3 months behind on the mortgage and I can't see myself not paying this mortgage. And I don't want to have to deal with the money just keep backing up. That's why I haven't called them to do the deferment. I just want to sell this house. And when we walked through that house, I had to do everything I could to keep my mouth shut, because this guy, this 24, 26, 28-year-old guy had the mouth that I couldn't believe, talking to his mother and even the other agent. He didn't say anything to me specifically, but the remarks that he was making and the F-bombs and everything else were like incredible. And I'm like that type of guy that I'm gonna be like, hey dude, why don't you just chill out? That's your mother. But I didn't want it to go there. So that's what's even happening with renters, with family members. It gets crazy. All right.
Can you imagine how backed up the courts are going to be too, and probably 6, 7, 8 months behind if they do lift it in January.
Yeah.
So people could probably go a year and a half without getting anything and having tenants living for free.
Yeah. Yep. And so here we are. I mean, it's just going to be craziness the next probably 24 months in real estate. You know, it's one thing when you own the property and you can do deferments and you can do this and you can do that. But what if you saved up all your money, you bought an 8-unit property? You know, I know some guys like that. Like one guy, he was a mailman, right? And he saved up like $300,000-$400,000, bought an 8-unit in New Britain. And now that was like one of his retirement things that he was going to make, you know, $3,000 a month from that. And now he's like almost down to zero. He can't afford anything.
You know, that's disgusting about that son. That's disgusting. Just my opinion.
Well, it's kind of disgusting to me too that the government puts things together for only a certain type of people. Like, let's just say, and then believe me, I got nothing against tenants, right? But if you're going to do that for the tenants, well, what about, they know that there's people like us all on this class right now that bought a 3-family, 4-family, 6-family, maybe we own a couple of them. And what have they done for us? They just made our lives like 3 times harder and took away maybe some of our life investments for retirement and so forth. You know, it's like not fair when it comes, and I hate to say that because it sounds
well, everybody I mean, it's what's sad is that there's so many laws like that, like FMLA. I mean, that's just a law that was meant to be a good thing. People take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Take advantage of their situation.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's the whole thing from period to period, periodic tenancy. Like technically, you know, this woman has to give her son in writing a document, you know, maybe have him served that says he has 30 days to move out. Otherwise, she's going to start the eviction process. You know, and in today's world, you're really not going to be able to start the eviction process, you know, because like you said, the courts are all backed up month to month.
Maybe I shouldn't have asked that question.
No, well, we always get into these things during this unit, so that's okay. You know, I mean, it's really a lot of things that people have. And sometimes people come in with their personal stories too, and that's okay. I just don't want you to feel like I'm against you if you're a tenant, because if you're a good tenant, there's a lot of good tenants. And, you know, that's one of the reasons why I got into real estate, is because I grew up where my parents owned a 3-family home and we lived on the first floor. And Do you think my parents were the greatest landlords in the world? No, they didn't know what to do. So they would basically, some woman with 2 little kids would come to my mother and be like, oh, I really need a place to live. And can you please give me this apartment? We think my mother would check to see if she has a job or how her credit was or anything. No, then the woman would move in. And then, for the whole 30 years that my parents owned that 3-family, you think they made money? No. The people from the 2nd and the 3rd floor, some of them were so nice. Some of them would come downstairs and be like, hey, can I borrow? One time we had this guy, he says, hey, Mrs. Rosa. And I was like 12 years old. We were sitting at the kitchen table. Oh, Mrs. Rosa, can I borrow I'm trying to cook dinner. Can I borrow some hot dog rolls? Do you have any hot dog rolls? It was during the summertime. We had cooked on the grill. And my mother's like, of course, here you go. She gave him a package of hot dog rolls, right? Nobody thinks nothing of it. You give a package of hot dog. We had an extra package of hot dog rolls. So now, like 15 minutes later, he comes downstairs. Hey, Mrs. Rosa, do you think you have any hot dogs to go with those hot dog rolls? We were like, what the heck? One thing if you wanted some ketchup or mustard, but first he comes down for the hot dog rolls, then he waits 15 minutes and comes down for the hot dogs. I don't know, I thought that was funny. Holdover tenancy. What is a holdover tenancy? That's an important one. It's in your book and it's in bold. So it could be very, very important.
When the tenant is still in the property, but no new lease has been signed.
Right. So let's just say that you had an estate for years, right? Like you had a start date and an end date. And then basically the tenant stayed there, right? You thought they were moving out, like we said, on the December 22nd. December 23rd comes along, January 22nd. They don't want to leave, right? That's considered to be a holdover tenancy. And some leases will basically state that there's the rent will increase automatically if there's a holdover tenancy. Some leases won't even approach the idea, won't say anything on their lease. And if they don't, then it becomes an estate from period to period, which is basically the default for the state of Connecticut. All right. And so, you might have to actually, if you have a holdover tenancy where they're basically staying an estate at sufferance, which we're going to talk about, you might actually have to start the eviction process. All right. So the next one is an estate or tenancy at will. So what's an estate or tenancy at will?
It's an indefinite term.
Right? Indefinite, unspecified or uncertain term. So, it was kind of like that with her son, where she's like, yeah, just move in. And when you get yourself, on your feet, you and your girlfriend, and even the girlfriend was starting to make some comments when we were walking through the house. Oh, you're effing selling this house now? What? You think we're just going to walk away so easily? And I'm like, you're going to talk to your mother-in-law or your future mother-in-law or whatever you think this woman is who let you into your house with your kids. You're going to talk to her like that. I wanted so bad. Even right now, it's bothering me. I should have said something. That's a regret. But if I said something, it probably could have got really bad, because you never know. The sun could have gotten my face or something like that, and then who knows what's going to happen from there.
That's just disrespectful, regardless of who it is.
Yeah. So, but that's tendency. Well, hey, come and live over here as long as you want. Like, you basically don't talk about it, right? Or maybe you do. You say, hey, you can live here, for a year or two, whatever's good for you. So it kind of, like, if you think about it, yes, it's such a thing, because all the state laws are different. But really, if you think about it, in Connecticut, it's kind of like it conflicts a little bit with the month to month, because remember, if you don't have anything signed, if you don't have a start date and an end date, it's really month to month. So, that's why it gets a little bit tricky dealing with the tenancy at will. And, you know, it's very like, you know, if you were to go to court to try to figure out, well, what exactly was said and how it was said, could become an issue.
It sounds like everything goes back to the month to month at the end of everything just goes back to that.
Yeah, I mean, unless you sign a new agreement.
Right.
You know, unless you sign a new agreement. All right, estate at sufferance. So who knows what's an estate at sufferance?
Is when a leasee stays there without paying the mortgage, without paying the rent,
Right? And
or
so
without
again,
landlord's consent.
yeah, and so that could be considered a holdover, right? The tenant is basically failing to surrender possession of the property, right? It's a holdover tenancy. And so the landlord would technically have to start the eviction process if that's what they wanted to do. Right. So let me ask you this. Now, remember, I'm not trying to pass judgment, and I'm not trying to tell you exactly what you should do and how you should do it and what I think is the right way and the wrong way. But as a landlord, we're not talking about shallow thinking. We're trying to get deep and open up our minds a little bit. As a landlord, should you always have a lease and that's it? Is it the best thing to have a lease when you're a landlord?
Absolutely.
So
You
we got
should.
Absolutely. What else?
Yes, you should. I've had many properties, and if you don't have that lease, people tend to first of all, they're not going to act right anyway, and they're not going to pay on time. I found that a lot, but then, you know, I always refer them back to the lease, and I put a lot of details in the lease. Even minor little things as far as smoking, garbage, you have to be real detailed, because at the end, when you go to housing court, they'll say, well, she didn't tell us this, or she didn't tell us that. And, you know, it's a certain day, you pay on the 1st, they always pay on the 10th or the 11th, and you really have to hit them with the late fees, because they will take advantage and they'll pay up. And then the next month, the same thing. But you really do have to have a lease.
Okay, that's really great points, and I agree with almost all of it. Does everybody agree with all that? Anybody have any other thoughts?
I mean, I always ask for renter. I always ask that they get renter's insurance and to put me as a on that renter's insurance as well.
Okay, anybody else?
I have 2 leases for both my daughters. One, a house down in Bridgeport for her because she goes to Sacred Heart, and one in Tampa. The one in Tampa is an apartment complex. They required a certain insurance policy. They required a deposit, you know, the whole thing. And they're very strict. You're late, you pay, you know.
Yeah.
If you do an automatic deduction out of your checking account, they give you a discount.
Yeah.
So that's better. This other one is a personal lease. It's, you know, his house, and he's renting it to 5 girls. And he's not bad though. I mean, but he took a lot of deposit. Took first month, last month, and security. He's holding like $7 grand on these girls.
Yeah. Is there such a thing as that? Is that against the law in Connecticut?
No.
Well, let's
No.
talk about that in a minute. All right.
I don't think it is. If it is, then I got something to hold on.
All right, so let's talk about some of these things. So first of all, here I was with almost everything everyone said, I agreed with for a lot of years. And then about 6 years ago, I met this old Italian guy, right? So I'm Italian, I could have a little bit of fun. You know, we talk about the old Italian guy. This is a true story. He owns a 8-unit commercial property, 8 units, you know, there's a barber shop, there's a vape store, there's a little tailor, there's a nail salon. And guess what he taught me? Because again, we're not talking about shallow thinking. We're talking about next level thinking. We're talking about opening up your mind. Leases are no good in a lot of cases for the seller. Well, what do you mean, Rob? I've never heard of that before. My lawyer, there might even be a lawyer that watches this video and they're like, no, that's not true. He's giving bad advice. Well, I'm not giving you advice. I'm just saying some ideas. Here's the point of this old Italian guy. He said, hey, Rob, I don't give a lease. You kidding me? He's like, yeah, when I give them the keys, they got to give me the money, and I give them the big list of all the rules and regulations and how much the rent is, when they got to pay, and when they got to pay, and the rules and regulations and how much the security deposit is. But I don't give them the end date. It's a month to month. It's a written agreement, month to month, the rules and regulations. Because if I wake up tomorrow morning and I want to sell this property and maybe I need a couple of them to leave, I could tell them, hey, 30 days notice, you got to go. Or what if I wake up in the morning and I say, oh my gosh, the taxes, the insurance just went up and I want to raise their rents $100 each. 30 days notice, I give them, they got to go up $100. If they don't like it, they got to leave. Right? So just remember, as a landlord, if you're thinking about selling anytime soon, you're worried about taxes going up, you're worried about insurance going up, you might not necessarily want to be signing 1 year or multi-year leases. You might, of course, with Chanty mentioned and a couple other people, yes, you need the rules and the regulations there. You need it to be written how much they got to pay. You need it to be written how much is the security deposit. But do you want to maybe do a 1 year? If you really think about it, a 1 year lease as a landlord could hurt you. Because if you want to sell that property, those rents are locked in for 1 or more years. And maybe a buyer comes along who's willing to give you this price that you've been waiting for years. And now they look at the leases and they're like, oh, well, this guy's locked into these rates for these rents up until next October 2021. We got to wait a whole year in order to do what we want to do. Forget it. You see? So does everybody see where I'm going with this? Think about, if you're the landlord, it might not necessarily help you to do a certain time period. Right?
But wouldn't it always be smart, you would say, to do a month to month, because that would protect you if you want to sell the property, but it also, helps you to make sure the tenants know the rules and regulations of the property. Or is your friend even against that?
No, he definitely does the rules and regulations.
But
right?
having like a month to month lease, like making them sign. Oh, okay.
So he doesn't use the word lease. He uses a different word. He never uses the word lease.
He uses the word agreement, and not agreement. And I don't know if it really matters. Like that's more of like a lawyer technicality. I think it's more of that. The whole point that I'm really trying to make is that it might not help you to sign for a certain period of time. Like a 1 year lease. Like everybody, most people, the vanilla thing is, okay, you're moving in November 1st. Here's the lease until next October 31st, right? And as the landlord, that might not help you because you might want to sell it. You might want to go up on the rent. You might wake up one morning and be like, you know what? I asked this person 7 times already to not put garbage in the back hallway, and they keep doing it. So I'm giving them 30 days notice to move, and that's it. I don't want them in this place anymore. And you can do that because you don't have a 1 year lease. It's a month to month lease or month to month agreement, whichever way you want to put it.
So with the agreement, if they stop paying, does he still hold eviction process that he can do or stop?
Everything's the same of what we have in our minds, except, and I had to absorb this myself. Everything's in the same of what we have in our minds, except for the term, right? Because you have a lot more. Why? And he tells you, hey, and he'll still tell me. I mean, I'm thinking about, we're talking about maybe selling it for him, but he wants a lot of money. So, but the point is, he'll tell me, hey, if I want them to go, I give them 30 days notice. They got to go. That's it. Why do I got to be locked in for them? He says, listen, he goes, some of these people, they put together the 1 year lease and they think they got the people locked in, especially when it comes to commercial. Some of these commercial leases, they want to do 2, 3, 4 years. Why am I going to do that? Maybe I need to go up on the rent. He goes, and if they don't want to pay me the rent, he goes, they're not going to pay me regardless of whether I got 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. which is kind of true. I mean, if you talk to this guy for like 15, 20 minutes, he's going to talk your ear off. He's a nice guy. He's awesome. But you probably learn a lot from him too. Because it's like things that he says, it's not the regular of what you hear all the time. You know what I'm saying? So, oh, and then we're going to talk about security deposits in a few minutes. Right? So that's important. So we'll get to that. So requirements of a valid lease. So remember, we talked about usually to be enforceable in court, the statute of frauds says that it has to be in writing, right? Now, again, to be a valid lease, it's usually the same requirements as almost any other agreement or contract, right? They have to have the capacity to contract, meaning parties must have the legal capacity to contract, be of legal age and sound mind, right? Has to be for a legal objective, something that's not prohibited by law. There has to be offer and acceptance, a meeting of the minds, right? Most people have to have a mutual agreement. There has to be valid consideration. So again, when we say consideration, what are we usually talking about? Right, the moolah, but it could be for labor, for work being done, right? Fixing up the property. I know there's one guy that got stuck with this one tenant in there that the tenant was, gave him all the promises he was going to do all kinds of stuff. And basically for a period of 2-3 years, the guy didn't do anything. And now the landlord's like, trying to get him out because it wasn't specific enough. All right. And so, you want to make sure that the lease agreement is specific and it has all the information like the address, the apartment number, what they're willing to include, what you're not willing to include. People will make assumptions. Oh, well, I saw that there's storage space down here, so that's included. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Is one of the garages included? Is the back porch included? Depending on what you want to do, is can they hook up a washer and dryer? So the more specific you are with the rules and regulations of what they can do and what they can't do, hopefully cuts back on any miscommunication or issues that will come up, right? So there is what's called, between a landlord and a tenant, the covenant of quiet enjoyment. So what is the covenant of quiet enjoyment?
It has to do with the landlord coming and going.
That's right. So basically, it's saying that the lessee or the tenant can occupy the premises without interference from the owner or anyone else. So in the state of Connecticut, how much time do you have to give the tenant before you're going to go into the apartment? What's the rule? What's the law?
24 hours.
Sounds good, right? Is that what it really is? What's it say in your red book? Right? So there is not an exact number of hours. It says that you have to give them a reasonable amount of time. Could it be 24 hours? Maybe. Could it be 36 hours? Could it be 48 hours? But you have to give them in writing. You're supposed to give them a reasonable amount of time, and you can still go in there at any time for an emergency, right? The water's leaking, the water pipe busted, the gas is leaking, whatever it might be, right? So depending on the scenario, you can go in there right at this minute. If you're a landlord and somebody tells you, hey, there's water coming through the ceiling from the second floor, you don't have to give them 24 hours notice. You go in there right now, right? But
Bob, I got a question on that.
Yes.
My daughter's house in Bridgeport, the guy he's restoring an old Mustang in the garage. And he just shows up at any time and goes in the garage and works on it. So he really should be advising them. Right?
Well, it depends what's in the agreement.
It doesn't say it in the agreement. It was verbally told to the girls.
Then he can do it. Like, put it this way. This is a weird one. You guys want to hear a weird one? I got this guy who's talking to me about this house that he rents out. And, but he uses the basement. It's kind of weird or it's funny to me. He's like, yeah, he goes, I rent out this house He says, but I don't rent out the basement. The basement's not included. I just go over there. He's like 70 years old. He goes, when me and the wife start arguing, or maybe sometimes I just want to go over there, watch TV for a couple hours by myself or have a nap. He goes, or I'll meet up with somebody, we'll play checkers or something. I meet him in my basement because it's like a walkout basement. I said, so you rent out the house to people? Because he wanted me to rent it out for him, but you don't rent out the basement. So he's like, yeah, I got it locked. He goes, I'm not going to go upstairs and they're not going to come downstairs. I'm like, oh, okay. But I was like, this is so weird to me. That's kind of weird, but you can do it. That, you know, that's what if you don't mention it in the lease or you do mention it in the lease, that's the whole point. So it would seem that your daughter probably, if it doesn't mention anything, then he's got the right to do that because he didn't tell them that the garage is included, right?
No. I mean, they can use the garage, one side of the garage, but it doesn't really specify that. But it's just like, she's like 8 o'clock in the morning, the garage door's going up after partying, you know?
Yeah, kind of weird. It's not
It
nice.
is weird.
He should have told them, like, he should have told them, hey, listen, you know, every 3, 4, 5 days, whatever, I'll come over here, work on the Mustang. Sometimes I'm here at 7 in the morning. Depends on the scenario. So just so you know, if you see me around. But if he kind of put it on them as a surprise, it's kind of not really cool, you know. I don't like that kind of stuff.
I know, but I don't want to make waves, you know.
Yeah, it's kind of weird though, you know.
It is weird.
Right, so that's really pretty much the next section in the book, the use of the premises. So really, I mean, you should have provisions in the lease or the agreement or whatever you want to call it, right? That basically says, okay, what's to be used and what's not to be used. Like in a lot of my leases, I will put in there that the tenant has no access and not to use the basement. Because usually it always does turn out to be a problem. Not always, I should say most of the time, it turns out to be a problem. And the problem is that they start putting stuff down there and then when they leave, who has to clean it up, right? Or they get mad at you and who starts cutting up wires or breaking pipes and stuff like that. So it really, unless you have a specified space and maybe you're able to get a little bit more rent for that and you're able to help out the tenant a little bit, you know, and it's basically separated from the mechanicals, meaning the boiler and the electrical system and all that good stuff. It doesn't a lot of times turn out to be a good scenario to just keep the basement open to the tenants. You know, I'm talking for multifamily house. I guess if it was for a single family, that would be different. But anyways, so, you know, you should have those limitations in there. You should have the term of the lease, which I think that's what we really were talking about, is that, you know, this old Italian guy, he doesn't go for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. He goes for month to month. That's what it is. Because he never knows. He's like, I'm an old guy. If I wake up in the morning, I want to change my mind on something, then that's what I should do. I think it's kind of funny, but it's kind of true if you think about it, right?
Yeah.
Because it really only helps the tenant, if you think about it, to have a 1-year lease. It doesn't help you as the landlord. It makes things harder for you. You're the one who's locked in. You might be thinking, oh, well, I'm definitely going to get my money then for 1 year. No, because you could be 2 months, 4 months, 6 months into the lease. If the tenant doesn't have the money or doesn't want to pay it, what are you really going to do? Oh, I got the lease. You know, security deposit. So number one, so we have to, again, not shallow thinking. We have to peel away another layer of the onion, right? It's Friday. Hopefully you're going to meet up with your spouse, your partner, your friends, your whatever. And maybe you do some cooking tonight, right? With your friend, you can have some wine or whatever, do some cooking. You got to peel away the next layer of the onion. Get a little bit deeper, right? Peel away get some garlic, chop that up a little bit tonight, right? So the point is, let's talk about security deposits, right? Okay. Security deposit, first of all, what is a security deposit?
I mean, it's money held in the account if something, when the leasee leaves, if something is wrong with the apartment, there's holes in the wall, which I guess would be written in the contract itself.
That's right. So it is money that's supposed to be held in an account, an escrow account. Is it the landlord's account?
No.
Right? Who gets the interest from that money?
The
Lessee.
landlord.
Let's see.
Who's supposed to get it? And you're according to
Lessee.
the
The
book,
leasee.
right? The lessee. And we're going to talk about that when we get into the red book of things. So the second thing is when we talk about is that, so if I tell you, and what I really want you to do is to get rid of this whole terminology, first month's, last month's, 1 month security. Because if I'm asking you to give me first month's and last month's rent, technically, now of course, first month is okay, I give you the key, you're gonna give me the rent to move in for the first month. Because remember, rent is prepaid most of the time. So that's understandable. But if I'm asking for last month's rent, technically, what is that?
You don't have
Prepaid
to
rent,
payment.
Months.
right? That's technically prepaid rent. And there in the state of Connecticut, that would technically be considered a security deposit in order to move in. So it's not rent. Right? So that's why if somebody tells you first month's, last month's, and 1 month security, it's technically 2 months security deposit. Do you follow me? Can they tell you first month's rent to move in? Let's say you want to rent out this place November 1st. Oh yeah, give me first month's, last month's, and 2 months security. Can they do that in Connecticut?
No, you're not allowed to ask for more than 2 months security.
That's right. You're not allowed to ask for more than 2 months security deposit. And things get very, very tricky because let me tell you something. I've never seen on a lease, and I've seen a lot of leases, and maybe you've seen it, maybe you have one, but I've never seen on a lease that it says that the tenant has given me first month's, last month's, and 2 months security. Have you ever seen that? No, it always says, okay, here's the rent and here's how much for the security deposit. Okay, can I tell you? So remember, the most you can do in the state of Connecticut is 2 months security, right? But then there's even exemptions or restrictions if it's a senior citizen, meaning 62 years or older. Then how much is the most you can charge for security deposit?
1 month's rent.
1 month, right? 1 month. Can I tell you, oh, you have a dog, right? So I'm going to charge you 2 months security deposit and an extra $300 for the dog. Can I do that?
I think you can do it. I've seen it many a times. I don't know if it's legal or not, but I've definitely seen it.
In Florida, you can. I don't know about Connecticut.
Well, remember, what's the most I said you can do for security deposit?
2 months.
2 months. So any dollar that you're asking more than 2 months, if they're not a senior citizen, is against the law. Now, could I say, okay, give me 1 month security deposit and $425 because of your parent for security? Yeah, because that's still only 1 month and $425. As long as the rent's not more than $425, you know what I mean? Let's say the rent is $1,000 a month. So the rent is $1,000. I say, okay, give me $1,000 security for the apartment and $425 for the parent. Yes, because then technically the security deposit is $1,425, but it can't be more than $2,000, no matter however you break it down. And I can tell you this, as a landlord and even as a tenant, you want to keep things simple so that there's no confusion, because now I'm going to sound like a really, really bad guy. Okay. But I'm just telling you the way that things roll. I mean, at one time I had 54 apartments that I owned, and I dealt with them all. And I helped a lot of those tenants over years buy their own home. Then I put another person in, help them buy their first home, help another person. But every now and then you get some bad apples, right? And so the last month of the lease, does the tenant get to say, oh, well, you have 2 months security deposit, I'm not going to pay my last month's rent? Does the tenant, is that allowable?
Technically, no.
If it's a security deposit, no.
No, that's
If the-
not allowable.
first last month's rent, at that point, it would be allowable if that was your verbiage when you typed up your lease.
Well, number one, I never seen a lease typed up like that. And number two, technically that prepaid rent that's more than after the first month or second month, that last month's rent is technically security deposit. If it's money in order for you to get the lease, then it's technically security deposit. If it's money that's not going to the first or second month's rent, maybe you want to pay a couple months up front, that's understandable. But if I say, oh no, you have to pay me last month's rent, meaning October of 2021 in order to get this unit, that's technically security deposit. So you can't do that.
Rob, I'm reading, I got this lease in front of me. So it says base rent. Now this is all the girls. I agree to pay $45,000 annually
Mhm.
plus $7,500 security deposit as base rent to be paid as follows. Then he has all the months and he
Yeah.
does have the last month listed, which is May 1st.
Yeah.
So if
He
all
has-
goes well, then they get the whole 7,500 back between the
Yeah.
girls, right?
Exactly. Yep. And you see, that's less than 2 months because that rental amount is almost $4,000 a month, give or take, well, 3,600 or whatever that number comes out to be.
3750.
Yep, 3,750. So that's the 7,500. What, 7,500?
He took 7,500 security deposit.
Yeah, so that's exactly 2 months, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's fine. Right. But here's the point. I had a tenant. She was, and I'm telling you straightforward, maybe these are things I should not mention because I don't want you to, well, if you think of me this way, you do. What am I supposed to care? Right. I had a tenant. I'm doing my part. I gave her a nice apartment. Every month she was either late. She had one time her boyfriend got arrested for drugs, for possession of drugs in the apartment. I asked her, I said, listen, I don't know if this is working out. The other tenants are complaining about you. She would give me a hard time. She would break this, break that. Everything was like, I just wanted to get the woman basically out. And then I had to even start an eviction process with her, go to the housing court 4 or 5 months into this whole thing. And then the housing authority said, we made an agreement to put her back in there. And then what did she come up to me for the last month? Now, I knew she trashed the apartment. I knew the apartment was trashed. I had only asked for 1.5 months security. That's on me, right? I hate when people, well, I don't hate when people say that, but people say that to me. That's on me. I only asked for 1.5 months. I should ask for 2, but I was, before the first time we met, I'm trying to be Mr. Nice Guy. So here I was in the account. I had 1.5 months security. That's like $1,500, so it was even less. That wasn't going to cover all the repairs that I had to do from her trash in this place. She comes to me. So here she is. Let's just say it's September 1st. I'm not paying my rent. You could use my security deposit. I said, no, your security deposit does not go towards your missing rent. Well, I'm not paying it. Take that money. So guess what I did on the 11th of that month?
You gave her a notice to quit.
I started the eviction process and I evicted her, right?
How long did it take?
She moved out and I still went to the court to put the eviction on her record so that the following landlord who comes across her would see that she has a housing violation and what kind of tenant she was, because it was the principle of the matter for everything that she did. And still to this day, right? Still to this day, she owes me that money from that rent that she never paid, because technically she owed me, I think it was like $925 for that month's rent. And then the repairs that needed to be done from her trash in the place was like another $2,000 over the $1,500 or whatever that I got from her, $1,200 and something. So she's technically still to this day owes me like $3,000. Do you think I'm ever going to see that money? Like, that's $3,000 out of my pocket. And you might be like, well, Rob, why did you do that? You should have just, let it go and take the money from the security towards her rent. But you see, it cost me like 3-4 grand. And that's with even me going there on Friday night, Saturday morning, Sunday morning, painting, caulking, filling holes in the walls, scraping nasty stuff off the hardwood floors, you know.
Hey,
So-
Rob. Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry, man. I know. Hey, so, and I am not depleting anything that she did. I think it's gross and disgusting. And I've lived my life with renters my entire life, and I have some incredibly screwed up stories about them. But can you write off that loss on your taxes?
Well, of course, it's like an expense or a cost, but think about it this way. I can write off the gallon of paint for $47 or $43. But can I write off the 4 hours of me painting?
No, I'm just,
You know
I'm
what
just-
I mean?
yeah, no.
Yeah.
And exactly, like, I'm not saying that I have, I mean, no, I don't get me wrong. I totally get that. I'm just wondering, in perspective, can you write off the loss of money, since it was a loss of money? Can you write off, because it's a corporation, it's a business, you can write off the money loss, if I'm correct. Is that correct?
Well, think about it this way. You know, it's just the terminology of the way you're saying it that it's kind of like skewing me a little bit.
Okay.
So here I am, I own this 3-family house,
Right,
right? And so somebody didn't pay me for September's rent.
right.
Well, it's just less income. What did I write off? You know what I mean? It's just less income in my pocket.
Right, okay.
And I still had to make that September principal, interest, taxes, insurance payment.
And
Right.
yes, and I
You know
totally
what I
get,
mean? It's
yeah, and I
like,
totally get that. I'm
Yeah.
just wondering, it for as much as you can, for the pain that it takes to ever see this person ever again, it just seems like you should be able to write that, a little bit of that, as a loss, so you recover some. I mean, not that you're not recovering anything, but at least you can write some loss off. I mean, I'm just wondering for my own head.
it's not really that you say, like, it's not a loss, like, I don't know. It's just basically, number one, it's less income in your pocket when it comes to not receiving the rent, and you're still making all the other fixed payments.
Right.
So technically that's kind of a loss, but depends how you say it. Because it's not like you could say, oh, she was supposed to pay me $925, so that's a loss. It's kind of like you just never received that income. Now, what might be additional expenses that you can write off is, okay, I had to go to Home Depot, but you can't get paid for those hours if you're the owner that you went to Home Depot and waited in line and did all this stuff for 2 hours. And then you bought this can of paint for $43. And then you're not seeing your family and your friends all day Saturday because you're sitting in there painting, right? Is that something you can write off? No, you can write off the $43 can of paint.
Right.
That's basically it. And now if I hired a painter, you might be like, well, then why don't you just hire a painter? Because that might be the smarter thing to do. Okay, so do I have $700 to give to a painter?
Right. Okay. I was just wondering. I didn't
No.
know. It sounds
Yeah.
like a loss in business. So could you write it off? But obviously you can't write it off in the mindset that I'm thinking.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
kind
that
of
seems
weird.
like weird that you can't, like, you know, when you have a business, when you send somebody an invoice and they never pay the invoice, you can write it off as the end of the year as a loss and get a credit for it. So if you have to evict someone and they say they don't pay you $3,000 of back rent and you have it kind of like in a court document, it seems weird if your rental property is set up as an LLC. It seems kind of strange that you can't write off $3,000 that your tenant does owe you. You can't.
Maybe if you
It's an
get the
LLC.
court that's kind of like an accounting thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think it's just weird how we look at it. Like, okay, if
Mm-hmm.
we perform a service, like you're a photographer, so you go and do $3,000 of photography work. They didn't pay you. Can you write that off as a loss? Yes, right? That's a loss. Because that's an account receivables that you've basically written off. You've tried for 9 months to get this $3,000. You didn't get it. And so now it's a write-off. But when it comes to you being a landlord for the 3-family house or 6-family house, I don't know. It doesn't really exactly work that way because what services did you perform? right? It's just less income, less revenue that you have, but you still have all those expenses. And you might even spend the money on the attorney and so forth. So there's more expenses that you have that decrease your revenue, meaning you get less net profit.
The only benefit you would have then is on your income taxes or whatever is showing less income and more expenses.
Yeah, I mean, and an LLC goes right through, if you're the member or a member of an LLC, it goes right through your tax return. It's not its own separate, right? So anyways, it kind of gets tricky. Those are like more of accountant types of questions. And again, a lot of times it just kind of depends on how you're looking at it, your mindset, because it is.
Now, when you do the eviction, how long does it stay on their record?
Oh, that's a great question. You know what? I don't know.
What?
Housing history. Yeah, I mean, housing history, I don't know. Is it 7 years? I really
Well, that's
don't
what I was
know.
going to say. Is it the same as a credit issue?
I don't know. That's a good point.
I thought everything was 7 to 10 years unless it was murder.
Yeah. All right. So that's the whole thing about security deposit, and we'll get even a little bit more deeper into it when we go over the red book, which is the specifics for the state of Connecticut. Right. Okay. Improvements. So remember, we're used to just automatically thinking about residential, right? And with residential, most of the time, tenants cannot really do improvements, you know, like putting up walls, taking down walls. They're usually not supposed to even paint. They're supposed to get your permission depending on what your lease says. And most of the time, if you're allowing somebody to paint, I would tell you that you should probably put in the lease that you have to approve the color. And if you have hardwood floors or tile, I wouldn't even do it. I wouldn't even allow them to, because what are you going to do when they spill a gallon of paint on your hardwood floors and now those hardwood floors are ruined? And they don't do it on purpose, but then they're the ones who respond, you know, then what are you going to do? Because there's some people that they're good painters, right? Like you asked my father to paint a room. Okay, because remember, I told you we own a 3-family house. You ask my father to paint a room, he's gonna paint it like Michelangelo. There's not gonna be paint drip marks. There's not gonna be nothing on the floor, right? It's gonna look beautiful, but guess what? It's gonna take him like 3 weeks to paint that one room. So you got to depend, it depends on who you have painting for you, who you have helping out, right? So, you know, you got to be careful because there's other people, they'll paint that room in one day, but you look and you're like, oh my gosh, they painted the trim work black. They painted the walls orange. There's orange paint on the hardwood floors. There's black paint on the windows. You're like, what the heck? And they're like, oh, this is going to be great for my game room. You're like, what the heck just happened over here? Why did I allow them to do this? And then when they leave, what do you have to do? You got to go for 40 minutes. It takes you 20 minutes to drive to Home Depot, wait over there to get the nice can of almond color off-white paint. That takes a half an hour. Check out, drive back. Now that's an hour and 10 minutes. Get yourself a coffee. And then it's going to take you like 2-3 coats, cost you $90 for 2 gallons of paint. And it's going to take you like 12 hours of your life because you decided to let that tenant do that. It's not the tenant's fault. It's your fault. Right? Sorry, my friends. I know this is a tough unit. Most of you are like, this guy's a jerk. What's his problem? But I'm telling you straight up how it works, right? Accessibility. Oh, so just staying on improvements. Remember, when it comes to commercial properties, a lot of times the tenant is responsible for the improvements, right? A lot of times in commercial leases, they might even install and remove trade fixtures. So who remembers what's a trade fixture?
I mean, anything that's related to, so my dad was a doctor. He rented an office space, so he had to put up walls in the offices to make separate rooms. I remember as a kid, when he left that office space, he asked me and my friends if we wanted to take sledgehammers to rip out the walls because he had to leave the property the way it was left. So we got to go rip out walls like that. But I would assume walls would be part if you were a doctor and you needed rooms.
Well, yeah, that's kind of an improvement, but like what, for instance, let's say if your father left tables, chairs, and so forth, and even equipment from his practice, right? He left it at the end of the lease, right? And now because maybe you were supposed to grab that stuff for him, but you didn't do it, and you're like, oh, I'll just get it next week. Now it's the end of the lease. The landlord changes the locks on the doors. Who does that stuff now belong to?
The landlord?
The landlord when it comes to commercial. So remember, trade fixtures that are left behind at the end of after a lease, when it comes to commercial leases, it usually everything now belongs to the landlord. You don't know how many times I've seen landlords where they rent out whether it's a nail salon or it's a little grocery store, a little restaurant, all the stuff that's left behind, now the landlord owns it. In fact, I just had this landlord, go ahead.
No, I see. That's from my experiences from owning a restaurant, a couple of them. At times, whenever I got into a lease agreement, it was always more than 15 years with the first right of refusal, because I'm putting in the hood unit, which is $1,000 per square foot, and I can't take it out when I'm leaving. So
that stuff gets expensive quick.
Right. They're expensive. Yeah. And so you got to have a good, you want something that you can have 15 years with first right of refusal. So if it's a successful business, you can't get kicked out. They can't raise the rent. And your investment on $50,000 in just one hood unit, or, $35,000 on a walk-in refrigerator and freezer isn't leaving, because you can't bring that with you.
That's right. That's right. Now let's talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? What are your obligations as a landlord? Do you have to, when we talk about residential and so forth, do you have to make any of the modifications that the tenant wants you to?
To a point, yes.
Okay, so Ron says yes. Anybody else?
I thought the tenant had to do it.
Right. So here's the story, is that the landlord has to allow the tenant to make modifications, reasonable modifications, if the tenant wants to and will pay for it. But the landlord may require or can require that the premises be restored to their original condition at the end of the lease term. So if somebody, again, they want to rent out your unit and they say, hey, listen, I already have my carpenter guy. If you give me this rental, they're going to put a ramp for me. Maybe they're in a wheelchair the rest of their life. They're going to put a ramp for me for the back stairs. You cannot say no. You have to allow for reasonable modifications that are within the town, permit codes and all that good stuff. You have to allow the tenant to do that, but you don't have to pay for it. You don't necessarily have to do it, right? When it comes to residential. Go ahead.
No. I was going to say like a wheelchair. Okay, residential. All right, I'm sorry. I'm thinking commercial because that's all my background is commercial. So I'm sorry.
No, that's right. When it comes to commercial, I mean, most of the time, if you're a commercial building owner, before you even get the opportunity to be able to rent it out, a lot of times, during the building or modifications of a building, the town is going to make sure that these things are in place anyways. That that there is a ramp and that there is this or there's that, and so sometimes things get a little bit crazy, right? With that, because it depends upon the use of the property and what has been approved to be doing business over there, right? So
that even holds true for employees in businesses, in some businesses.
Yeah. So the big thing to remember, though, is that you have to, if you're the landlord, you have to say that you do permit, right, the tenant to make reasonable modifications. Okay. Now, you also have to, as a landlord, maintain the units, which I think this is important because, you shouldn't be a slumlord for sure, right? And if you don't keep your property nice, then you're going to get people who don't care about where they live. And those are the people that might be disrespectful to their own property, your property, everybody's property, right? So it's only going to help you if you make the place nice, because you're going to attract people who want to live in a nicer place. and then you usually will have less problems. You probably, as the landlord, you're going to be responsible to make repairs to, of course, common areas like hallways, stairs, elevators. Usually if there's plumbing issues, if there's heating issues. Now you might be okay. You might be the landlord and say, okay, well, the tenant is responsible for the heat and hot water, right? They're paying for their own heat and hot water, right? But as the landlord, you still will most likely, especially for residential, not for commercial, but for residential, you will still be responsible for maintaining those mechanicals. So if it's an apartment and the tenant, it's gas, let's say, so the tenant's paying for their own heat, right? Well, if the boiler breaks down, you as the landlord might still be responsible for paying for the repair of that heating unit. Does that make sense to everyone? But not necessarily for commercial. For commercial, they might be responsible for everything, maybe even including a roof leak, right? It just depends on the lease and the way that you have it. All right. Destruction of premises. So depending on the scenario, a lot of time residential tenants can reduce their rent in proportion to the amount of space they are unable to use because of a fire, or they might be able to move out and not have to pay you at all if they have to move out because of the destruction of the premises. It just depends on so many different things, what kind of insurance you have as a landlord, what's covered, what's not covered. So things can get a little bit tricky with that. Now, when we talk about the word assignment of a lease, because we need to know the difference between assignment and subleasing. So who knows the difference between assignment and subleasing? What's the difference between assignment and subleasing?
So with the assignment, you pass the rights completely to somebody else, right? And the person who is assigning does not retain any responsibility. Whereas with subleasing, the lessee acts like a lessor, I guess, right? And now it's like a double stack situation.
Right. So with assignment, and usually if you're the tenant, you usually can't do this. I mean, of course, it depends on how it's written in your lease, but most leases are going to say that you can't just assign this lease to another tenant, because the landlord wants to know who they're doing business with, who's in their property. So most of the time you can't just do it unless you get the landlord's permission. And even the same thing with a sublease, and there are companies that they do this. This is their business model, where they will rent out a space at, let's just make it up, $10 a square foot. They know they're getting a great deal. Now maybe they spend a little bit of money making it really nicer, and then they go out there and market it for $15 a square foot, and then they're making the difference between the $10 and the $15 a square foot, right? And so again, that's considered to be a sandwich lease. Remember, the original tenant still remains responsible for the rent being paid and for any damage done to the lease, right? The new tenant is only responsible to the original tenant to pay the rent due. Okay. And so then you can also make other arrangements with the actual owner of the property to see who can be released from liability and that sort of thing. But, that's that whole thing about online rental services and all the different things that are out there. You just have to be really, really careful that, if you do go to rent a space or a unit or a temporary rental, that you are actually talking to the owner or someone who's truly authorized to work on behalf of the owner, because things get a little bit crazy. All right. When it
Is
comes
that similar? Sorry.
Right.
Is that similar to, how does that work? Like how, I know this is popular in New York, probably not in Connecticut, but when people rent rooms, like, not the entire space, but they rent sections of that one space. Like I know New York, they go as far as like one part of the basement, then another part of the basement. Sometimes they'll rent to people. Is that something similar to, because it's not the whole space?
Yeah, I mean, well, it kind of doesn't go by space. It goes by who's the agreement with. is the agreement
Oh,
with the true owner of the property, or is the agreement with, the person who's renting from the owner, the original tenant?
okay.
Yeah, and that's where it can get pretty tricky because, what if you're the landlord and I rent out this house from you $1,500 a month, right? And now here I am. I'm like, oh my gosh, money's tight these days. I could rent out this second bedroom or this third bedroom, whatever. I could rent it out for $500 a month. So now I go out there and I start marketing that I'm going to rent out this third bedroom for $500 a month. Well,
And that's the tenant doing that, not the owner. That's a tenant.
That would be kind of like a sublease,
Okay.
right? I'm still responsible to pay the landlord $1,500, and now I bring somebody else in that they're responsible to pay me $500 of the $1,500.
Wouldn't that be in the original contract by saying that when you're setting it up, you're the only person who this contract is for? Anything different is?
As the landlord, I mean, that's what I do. As a landlord, I want to make sure there's no subleasing or assignments. But
I've had issues with boyfriends and girlfriends. Like I purposely write the lease or the agreement with you. This is for you and you only. You're no person other than you can stay in the property. I don't have a problem, and I say it straight up. I don't have a problem with a boyfriend or girlfriend coming over for a night during the week. But any more than that, it's considered more than that, and I will expect additional pay if that's the case.
Right, and some tenants, they won't like that, and there might be even somebody in the class who's like, well, what's the big deal? So what, this person's going to move in and help this, so what, the woman is going to move in and help the guy pay his rent, right? What's wrong with that? Well, think about it this way.
More water.
Number one, you as a landlord are ultimately responsible for the safety of the other people. So you don't know if this woman just got out of jail for beating somebody up, and now she all of a sudden is beating up the guy on the second floor. You don't know that. Now, the people on the second floor could be like, well, why did you let her live here? For us, you did a criminal check. For her, you didn't. That's discrimination. So number one, discrimination. Number two, safety. Number three, let's talk about money. Well, guess what's really, really expensive? I'm just going back to the typical three family house. Typical 3-family, 1, 2, 3 units. What is really, really getting really expensive these days that you have to pay for as a landlord every month?
Electricity.
Well, most likely you're not having to pay for that. I mean, unless it's the common areas. Cool water. Right?
Water bill.
Getting expensive. Now, if somebody moves in 1 or 2 extra people, right? That could be like another $100 a month out of your pocket that you didn't necessarily sign up for, right? So there's a lot of things. It could be another car in the driveway, right? And maybe you only have 3 spaces in that driveway as it is. Now it's causing friction with the other tenants because you didn't approve for this person to move in. You knew that you couldn't have a 4th car there, right? So the things escalate and snowball when those sort of things happen. And so you as the landlord are responsible to know, really when it comes down to every person, but you could definitely say every adult that's living there, right? You're for the safety, for the emergency procedures, for criminal records, for financial reasons, you should know who's living in your building. Right?
Can I say something though?
Yep.
But one thing I could say as a landlord, the state does make it hard because we have had an issue in one of our places that we didn't find out that this person was living in there in the house with somebody that we didn't have on a lease. But then the person started trouble, the person who obviously moved in with the girlfriend or whatever. And then when you call the police, if they started getting mail there,
Yep.
especially without us knowing, and they've been there for a certain amount of time, it's hard to evict them even though they're not on a lease, which is bullcrap. The state goes for, it's hard. It's like you're, as a landlord, you're fighting the state because they'll be like, well, he has mail coming here, which you don't know they have mail coming here, but they ought to show you pull out a mail with that address.
Yeah.
So it makes it hard to evict that person who you never leased it to.
Yeah, I mean, really, when it comes down to the number one thing, or the easiest, which is still very, very hard, is non-payment of rent, right? Still, if somebody doesn't pay their, and then we're talking in pre-COVID, if someone doesn't pay their rent, it was still so hard to evict them, right? Now, everything under that is exponentially harder. And believe me, I've done it. I've evicted people for moving in unauthorized occupants. I've evicted people for criminal activity. I've evicted people for, what was the other one I wanted to say? Oh, trashing the apartment, right? For, you know, basically making it an uninhabitable conditions. And all of those things are so hard as it is in this state, including non-payment of rent. So that's why you really, you know, will it cost you some money? You got to get an attorney who's willing to fight for you and really try to play it cool sometimes. And you know, here I am, I'll tell you straightforward, I'm videotaping this. This is going out on YouTube, and that's fine. But the truth of the matter is that sometimes the easiest way is to just offer money for them to leave. And that's usually the cheapest and easiest way, is to be like, hey, listen, I'll tell you what, man, I want you out of this place. Give you $500, get all your stuff out and everything by Wednesday of next week, and I'll give you $500 cash.
What?
And guess what? A lot of times they'll do it. And that way you just get rid of them. You don't have, I'll give, oh man, I'm not gonna move out for 500. Are you kidding me? I'll give you 700. I'll give you 750. I'll give you 750 cash. I'll come here 750 cash if on Wednesday at 5 o'clock this place is empty. I'll give you $750 cash. You'll do that? Yeah. And then they do it, because then you don't have to wait. You don't have to go to an attorney. You don't have to go to court. You just get them out, cut your losses, repaint, clean up the place, and hopefully you learned from it, because you had to take money out of your own pocket, and you get a newer, better tenant, and you don't worry about it going forward. A lot of times it will work. That's one of my secrets. So see, I'm giving you guys, right?
Do you do credit checks on your, do you do credit checks on people?
Heck yeah. So when you move into one of my places, number one, we look at, now, again, sometimes we're flexible, but we have to make the guidelines before we put it on the market. We have to say, okay, we write down the 4 or 5 bullet points, we put it on a piece of paper, and we put it on the counter of that place. And we say, and whoever meets that criteria first gets the apartment. I don't care what they look like. I don't care where they work, the whole thing, as long as everything's legal, because otherwise you open yourself up to discrimination, right? So the point is usually we say, okay, and again, here's my secrets to you for leases and for being a landlord, right? I'm trying to help you out, right? And I'm not even charging you extra.
Right, thank you.
Number one might be like, okay, you need a credit score of 650 or above. So if someone's 649, they can't get it, because if you accept them and you don't accept somebody else, that could be discrimination. So number one, here's the credit score you needed to move into this place. Number two, I would usually say you can't have any evictions or foreclosures on your housing record. Number three, you can't have any criminal record in the past, whatever number of years, let's say 5 years, right? Or you can't have any drug-related or violent-related criminal convictions on your record, because in the past, whatever number of years. Yes, people change, they do. People get rehabilitated, people want to get better, and that's cool. But do you want to be the landlord that's going to be their trial version? I don't, right? I'll say, okay, if you've been good, I'll make it up. No criminal, violent related crimes or drug related crime convictions in the last 3 years. Okay, so that'd be number three. And then number four is usually I say you have to prove lawful source of income or money or assistance, government assistance, that's fine too, of at least 2 times the amount of their rent per month. So if the rent is $1,000 a month, you have to show that you're making $2,000 a month. Where we get into hard times, which I feel bad for some of these people, is like self-employed people or a waitress or waiter, if they can't, or a barber, if they can't prove their income, I'm sorry, I can't. How can I rent it to you? I don't know how much you make. You're telling me, well, show me then your bank statement that you've been putting in, you know, $500 a week, which equals $2,000 a month. Can you show me that?
Do you accept a cosigner?
Yeah, or a cosigner. That could be a good thing. I don't really do. Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I just had a commercial lease that came up where we got a cosigner. All right. So those are like the, you know, the main 4 or 5 points, and then that keeps you out of trouble. And guess what? You don't pick a tenant. If you pick a tenant, you are opening yourself to discrimination. The worst thing that I hate, or one of the biggest things that I hate, is when a landlord will say, well, you know, before I rent it out to them. That's one thing if they're renting out a room and they're going to be living there with the person. But let's just say it's a guy or a girl that they live 10 miles away from this 3-family house. And they say, well, you know, before I rent it to someone, before I make the decision, I want to do an interview. I'm like, what do you want to do an interview for? Why do you need, what are you going to interview? Do you want to see what they look like? Do you want to see how they talk? Those are not acceptable decision criteria. So if I have somebody who's like that, a lot of times I will, if I can't convince them it's not a good idea because it opens you up to discrimination problems, I will not be involved because I'm not going to be involved in that kind of stuff. Right? I say, hey, here's the 4 or 5 criteria. The first person who comes with the money and meets these criteria, they get the rent, and that's it. You don't choose the tenant. The tenant chooses the space who's qualified for it. And then you keep yourself out of trouble, because otherwise you can find yourself in trouble pretty quick, right? And it's also not being a good person, and it's not doing things the right way. I know you're all like, what the heck, this guy, he's going off today, right? But that's, you know, there's some
It's a good subject.
Yeah.
No, that's very good advice
Yeah,
because
it's a
you
good subject.
cannot
It's a fun
discriminate. You cannot discriminate in the state of Connecticut, and
Anywhere.
you can, yeah, anywhere. But that's real good points.
Yeah, if you think you're going to choose the tenant yourself because of, you know, of this or that, you got yourself, you know. I look at the application, right? And we look at the application and do they meet these criteria? And we have a system where we say, okay, here's the link. The tenant has to go on there. The tenant has to pay $50. And then we get the nationwide credit report. We get the nationwide criminal background check, and we get the nationwide housing history report. So we know, right? We know. Recording a lease. So when we say recording a lease, we're talking about recording it in the town records. Do you ever have to do that? Does that make any sense to do that?
Sometimes, yes. On a long-term lease, you might want to.
Right. So where we're kind of getting to, which we're not going to get to today, but we're going to continue on this on Tuesday morning, is what? The Connecticut. In Connecticut, do you have to record a lease? And the answer is yes. If it's more than a year long, it's supposed to be recorded in town records. And if it comes down to you being the real estate agent for a commercial lease, you're going to want that, because what if a lot of those commercial leases are long-term? And sometimes as a real estate agent, you're going to get paid the commission on anniversary intervals. Like example, maybe it's a 10-year lease, and you're going to get a certain amount of money when they first signed the lease. Then you're going to get a certain amount of money 3 years, 6 years, 9 years. I don't know, I'm just making it up. Well, what if on the 5th year, the owner goes to sell that property and you're still scheduled to get paid on the 6th and 9th anniversary? You want to make sure that that new owner knows that you are owed your commission. And so that's why there should be a document recorded in town hall when it comes to those long-term leases. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right. What is the non-disturbance clause? What's a non-disturbance clause?
that they don't, or that they agree not to terminate somebody's tenancy.
Okay, when? So it was at one time a federal, I don't know if I want to say law or requirement. I think it still is. I'm pretty sure it still is. I'm like 90 something percent, but I never want to give anybody bad advice. The point is that if someone has a lease, right, has a rental lease with someone and the property goes under foreclosure, can the bank force that tenant to move?
No.
No. See, basically, and this is more of, I think it's more of a state, but it could be federal as well still, saying that the term of the lease, like let's say you have a lease that you signed and that it's up until May 30th, May 31st, right? So, but the owner, he just foreclosed on the property. He wasn't paying the mortgage, right? Well, when the bank takes over the property, let's just say they're taking it over today, they can't come to you and force you to move or evict you because you still have a lease for May 31st. Now, they might come to you and say, hey, listen, we really want you to move. We want this place to be vacant because it's going to be easy for us to sell. And, so we'll give you $2,000 to move. Yeah, if you're willing to do that, maybe you do that. But they can't force you to do it with a non-disturbance clause, basically saying that the mortgagee agrees not to terminate the tenancy of the lessee so long as the lessee is current in payment of the required rent. So you have to be up to date on your rent in order for this to be okay. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. So what is an option?
It's a option is as I said earlier, it's a first right of refusal. So
Right.
basically, once your lease is up, before they can rent or lease the property to somebody else, you have the first right to extend your lease or you can give it up.
Right. So there are things exactly that they might be called a renewal option, that they have the option to renew for another year or 2 years or whatever it might be. There might be a purchase option, right? Saying that, okay, after you lease out the space for 2 years, that you have the option to purchase the premises. It could be that there's a right of first refusal option where the tenant can buy the property before the owner accepts an offer from another particular party, right? So there are all these different options. And sometimes people, they'll try to work these things out. And a lot of times it turns out to be a little bit tricky. Usually the optionor, who's the optionor?
The leaser.
Right, the owner of the property, right? They're giving that option to the optionee, which is the tenant, right? And so if you really think about it, who's the only one that's really obligated? Who's obligated in an option? Who's the only party that's really obligated in an option agreement?
Lessor.
Right? The lessor or the owner or the landlord, whatever you might want to call that person, right? So you have to be careful about getting involved in things where you are the only person who's obligated, because it might not help out your situation. It might sound good on the surface, but what happens in 6 months, this person really does want to buy it for $150,000 because the market was good. And I mean, the market was okay when they first moved in a year ago. But now all of a sudden the place is worth $200,000. Well, guess what? If you had signed that option agreement, nothing you can do. You're in it. If they decide to buy it for 150, now it's worth 200. You just lost yourself 50 grand. Which, think about it this way: if you signed an option agreement last year or the year before, that tenant can now buy the property for that 150,000 and now it's worth 200, you just lost a lot of money. And there's nothing you can probably do about it, depending on how tight the option agreement is. Make sense?
Yep.
All right, my friends. Well, it's 12 o'clock. I'll be putting this out shortly. Just so you know, where are we going to leave? I mean, we're leaving off on options. All right. So I hope you are having an absolutely awesome day. And we look forward to you watching Leases Part 2. Thanks.